This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joie.
Brought to you by MediaTek. Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joie, and today is Thursday, May 13th, 2021, and my guest is Finbar Monian of MediaTek. Hi, Finbar. How are you?
Hey, Miriam. Great to see you again. Good to be on.
Thanks again for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I've got you on because MediaTek just announced the Dimensity 900 this week. And, for me, it's exciting because it was like always a gap in your lineup, and I always thought to myself, something's got to land there. And so I kind of want to talk to you about that and get your feeling for what it brings to the table, what it means for future phones, et cetera, et cetera. So tell us a little bit what's going on here.
Sure. I think you know us too well, Miriam, at this stage. Maybe you're predicting our moves now, but I think you nailed it. Obviously we've seen, a lot of adoption of 5G, over the last year and a half. MediaTek's had a lot of success with our 5G portfolio. And earlier this year, we launched the Dimensity 1100 and 1200 that are more at the premium flagship tier for the high end.
Yeah, for sure.
The Dimensity 900 that we announced this week, I think is really about bringing as many of those premium experiences as we can from the high-end flagship devices down into, this tier. But it's, it sits above like the Dimensity 800 family that we also had announced last year.
Yeah, and I know you've been very successful with even the cheaper Dimensities, like the 700. I just got two 700 phones recently. Actually, I'm going to talk about one of them on the show later with my guest, Igor. It feels to me like, maybe I'm wrong, but that you're almost flooding the market at the kind of entry-level 5G with this Dimensity 700. And to me, it's really exciting because I think accessibility to technology is one of the things that made me become a tech journalist,
Yeah, no, and I think that's always been very much core and part of MediaTek's mission, right, is to bring, that experience, that technology to everybody, right? And clearly, on a global basis, we're seeing, very high penetration of 5G. I think it's a little concentrated still in markets like the US, Europe, China, for example, and hasn't quite perhaps reached all the markets yet. But that's, certainly going to change over time. And so the Dimensity products at the, 700 series are obviously meant for more of that mass market, 5G expansion. And then we have the Dimensity 900 and the, 1000, 1100, 1200 families that bring, higher end experiences.
Yeah. And then you do have these kind of special chips too. I mean, and they're not probably that special in the sense that to me, they look special because they have a slightly different name, like the 800U, right?
Yeah.
And I realize this is more about the 900, but I'm curious if you can tell us more about the variations on these different models?
Yeah. I mean, some of those are more, specific SKUs where we emphasize specific features or we push the frequencies a little higher to give you slightly better performance, for example. But getting back to the Dimensity 900, I think we're migrating now to 6 nanometer technology for this series as well. So that's the latest technology. That brings about an 8% power improvement over previous 7 nanometer technologies, which is always important. And we're also bringing in like the Cortex A78 core, so the next generation core.
Oh, okay.
So that gives a CPU uplift as well. And I would say the other area that we're focused a lot on in this product is really around the imaging and the video HDR capability. I was just reading an interesting report this morning from Ericsson's Consumer Lab, where they've done an extensive study around 5G usage, and they're really seeing consumer behavior changing because of 5G.
Of course, yeah.
Cloud gaming and AR were two of the applications that they really said was really taking off with 5G consumers these days. So I think, the video, the gaming, the multimedia experience continues to be very important for consumers.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it sounds to me like there's a series of firsts going on here with the new 8 cores. And so how much of that technology is trickling down in terms of the different like modules in the chip, like the ISP, the DSP, the neural network / AI processing units, the GPU? Tell us how much of that you're going to be getting from the higher end chips down into the 900, which obviously is not a low end chip by any means. It's kind of more like your upper mid-range, premium mid-range chip, correct?
Exactly. I think a lot of the technology is migrating down. Of course, there are different price bands, so there are always some trade-offs you have to make in terms of features and performance. But same process technology, so we get all of the power benefits of 6 nanometer in the 900 compared to the 1100, 1200. Cortex A78, although in the high end it's quad core, here it's a dual core 78. So you have the 2+6 configuration here.
Got it. I was going to ask if it was 8 core total. Yep.
But 2+6, whereas the high end is a 4+4 configuration. I think the graphics will be scaled back a little bit, but again, still delivering a very premium experience, we think. And I would say the other big area that really leverages the high end is going to be in the camera, the ISP, and that capability. That's really, I think, we're delivering with the 900, really kind of the same experience of the flagship there.
You mentioned that twice now, and I want you to elaborate because imaging is a big part of my coverage.
Yeah.
And my audience loves cameras in phones. So tell us a little bit, what can we expect and how does that fit into, obviously it's hard because you're releasing these chips at different times, right? Like the 1000 now is what, like more than a year old, right? It's a year and a half or something, right?
Yeah, November 19, we announced it.
So you can't just go by the numbering, right? In terms of performance and specs. And so tell us, in this current zeitgeist of the way the chipsets are, where do you kind of fit in with the ISP? Because, obviously at the high end, we're seeing Qualcomm with triple ISPs right now, and things like that. So you folks at MediaTek have always pulled these features we see on other companies' devices and brought them in at a much more affordable price point. And that's always got me really excited and always got me hunting for the MediaTek phones because I'm like, hey, I can get all the goodness I get on a really expensive phone for a much lower price point without sacrificing performance.
Yeah. So let me maybe share a little bit. So on the Dimensity 900, we support up to 108 megapixels for the camera, and we can support up to 4 simultaneous camera inputs. So you can have up to four camera sensors, if you like, as we've seen with the devices these days, having multiple sensors. And I think since the Dimensity 1000, we've also evolved our camera ISP technology. So the same core technology sits now in the Dimensity 1100, 1200, and this new Dimensity 900 device. And that also brings with it then a full 4K HDR video engine, so you can really record full 4K HDR video. And then we've also built in a lot of hardware acceleration around that full dynamic range that you get with 4K HDR, HDR plus, HDR10 plus, I should say. Things like real-time translation of like standard SDR to HDR content. So again, all of your picture content, picture quality, scaling, performance improvement will be there with the 4K experience. So I very little difference in space, I would say, between those two tiers when it comes to the camera, the video capabilities.
Cool. And are you able to leverage at this tier the ability to have multiple cameras providing data to the ISP simultaneously to improve performance? We've seen this. A lot of it is software dependent because it also relies on the ML and AI cores, right?
Yep.
But I'm curious, like how much of that we're going to see at that price point, at that tier, right?
Yep. The platform supports up to 4 concurrent camera inputs, so you can have
concurrent. I didn't realize that's what you meant.
Yeah, you can have up to 4. Now, again,
wow,
that's up to the device makers and the OEMs of how they want to configure. So that's the peak capability that you can achieve with the platform. But again, I think you'd agree that's very high end capability built into the chipset. And again, we're giving our customers the ability to deliver those kind of experiences if they choose to.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting it. That's why I'm asking, because you folks are always pushing the envelope. So I'm like, okay, what tricks does Finbar have up his sleeve this time, right?
Well, it's not me. It's our engineers.
No, I know it's not you, but you're the face right now, so it's your fault.
Yes,
no, just kidding. But yeah, I think this is good. Tell us a little more about 5G capabilities on this chip. Obviously, you guys have now, even at the 700 level, dual 5G support, which is pretty tremendous. I suppose that's continuing here, right?
Of course, yeah. The Dimensity 900 leverages all of the proven 5G technology that we've been shipping. So we support, all of the voice over NR capabilities, all of the dual carrier 5G. We can aggregate the TDD bands and the FDD bands like we did from the very first SoC. All of the 5G dual SIM capability is built into this platform as well. So it's really leveraging all of the proven modem capabilities that we've already built in. Of course, we get some power advantages because of the 6 nanometer. So we continue to get some incremental improvements on the overall 5G battery and power usage there. But I think it meets all of the needs of the 5G sub-6 networks that we're seeing rolling out over the world, basically.
Right. So technically, this chip could, depending on how many power amplifiers and the front end basically you set up, you could support pretty much any band in any country at this time.
Correct. Yeah, I think we've got coverage built into our modem for all the sub-6 bands, and that would include, for example, even the new C-band spectrum that we'll start to see coming online in the US. So we've already got support for that capability built into the chipsets.
That's exciting.
Indeed. Yeah.
Maybe we'll get to see a Verizon device at some point. You know that they're now making devices that don't have millimeter wave, believe it or not, for their Visible, I think, brand, or one of their, virtual network operators. And so I think that's great because, not everybody needs millimeter wave. I mean, it's nice, but it's really just a one-trick pony in many ways. So,
and the coverage will be there with sub-6 bands, as we've seen in other markets. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so I'm curious as well about other things like Wi-Fi. Are we looking at Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 5, 6E?
Yeah, that's a good catch, actually. That's another area that we've leveraged the capabilities from the high end and brought it in. So this supports 2x2 Wi-Fi 6 Wi-Fi. So you get about a 30-40% speed improvement, compared to the previous generation. Like I'm comparing it to the Dimensity 800, 820 family from last year. Those integrated Wi-Fi 5. So we've upgraded to Wi-Fi 6 in this platform as well. So that's probably another area that the premium features are starting to trickle down into the 900.
Any Bluetooth improvements as well while we're talking radios?
Yeah, we leverage the same Bluetooth 5.2 capability that we talked about in the Dimensity 1200.
Okay.
I think the biggest kind of advantage there is support for some of the low power audio codecs and stereo codecs that you get with the Bluetooth 5.2. So that capability will be built in as well.
Oh, nice. So it's pretty future-proof. That's exciting.
Yep.
In terms of raw CPU and GPU power, obviously, as I said earlier, there is a non-linear performance difference between the numbered chips because they came out different time frames, right? Like you can't expect a chip that's a year and a half to perform as well, even though it was the highest end, to perform as well overall when you measure like power consumption and everything as a newer chip with a lower number.
Yep.
So where do you kind of fit the Dimensity 900 in the entire Dimensity lineup? If I were to look at benchmarks, I mean, it's obviously not something I focus on, but some people do, and I'm sure some of the listeners be curious.
Yeah, I think if you go back to a year ago, like we had the Dimensity 800, the Dimensity 820, I think just on raw CPU performance, like the compute intense activities, we're probably seeing 19-20% performance lift compared to that.
That's significant.
So some of that comes from the Cortex A78, the new CPU architecture. We have built-in support for LPDDR5, so the latest memory interface here as well. So you get some advantages on the memory throughput. And of course, the process technology gives us a little bit of a bump as well. So when you put all that together, we probably see 20%, something like that, compute performance. Graphics will be a little bit better as well compared to the previous one. Won't get as much as the Dimensity 1200, but again, it's a different tier.
Wow. Yes. And the 1200 is a pretty recent chip, so it's like you're still kind of comparing a little closer together, right?
Exactly. Yeah, like I think we're comparing really to, like, this is certainly a lift up from the Dimensity 800, 820 last year. And probably the other area I would point out is the AI, which we've talked a little bit about in other discussions, Miriam, but
Mhm.
AI is something we continue to invest heavily on in terms of integrating that capability into the chips. There, we probably see something in the order of like 40 to 80% performance improvement compared to the 800, the 820. So clearly, that's
Okay.
another big step up, and that's probably more in line with the capabilities that we saw in the flagship devices earlier as well.
Yeah, you can't really compare these things, one to one, in the sense that ML and AI is becoming such a significant part of the workloads now. Like, the ISP offloads some of the work to the ML AI stuff. The CPU, of course, the GPU if you're playing games as well. And so you don't really notice necessarily that this is happening as a user, but it benefits you in terms of performance for the same baseline. Like if you just get better games, say for example, better gameplay from a chip that has better AI and ML for the same CPU and GPU performance, like as a previous chip, right?
Exactly.
Because the games can take advantage of the improved machine learning AI stuff. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And I felt that, MediaTek has always impressed me. I have to run benchmarks when I do reviews for hot hardware. And every time I get a MediaTek device to review, I'm always like, wow, look at this AI performance, right? So I think this is one of the things that's always gotten me excited about MediaTek is you guys have always been on the forefront of the ML and AI story. And I guess it's continuing here as well. So that's exciting.
Yeah. I'm glad we still have the ability to surprise you a little bit, Mary. That's
Oh,
good.
come on. You know that. I mean, honestly, as I said, like I've got those two Dimensity 700 phones right now. Might as well name them. The Realme 8 5G just came out yesterday.
Exciting device.
Got one of those. I guess the second one I can't call out because it's coming. It's from our friends at Xiaomi. And honestly, using them, they feel to me just like if I was using an 800 from a year ago almost. And I mean, it's pretty impressive to see that, especially when you see the price point on that phone. £179 on the Realme 8 5G.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing, right? So of course that's the entry level 4 gigabyte, 64 gigabyte model. But a 5G phone, like that translates to what, 250, 220 US dollars?
Mm-hmm.
And who knows if it'll come to the US. Probably the Realme won't, but it'll come to the rest of the markets. And
Sure.
I mean, definitely India and stuff. So
no, I think that's a very exciting device. And again, I think it proves the other part of our, portfolio is around really enabling the technology for everybody, right? And I think the Dimensity 700, which we launched last year, is starting to show up now in these devices like you're mentioning. And you'll see more, of course. But it's very much that mission of, it's delivering the full 5G experience as well. Of course, you have to make some compromises between the different price tiers, but I don't think we've compromised that much, and I think it'll be compared to, let's say, 4G experiences, it will be a big step function for consumers.
for sure. So when do you think we'll be able to start seeing devices with this chip? This year or?
With the Dimensity 900?
Yeah, the 900.
The first devices will probably launch this quarter, actually, within weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
This is like,
eminent.
let's go, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
So next couple of weeks, keep your eyes open.
I wasn't sure, sometimes sometimes it's just a quad delay, especially now with the chip production constraints. I wasn't going to make any assumptions.
Yeah, no, but we expect Q2.
And you guys have this under control.
We hope.
You've been around the block a few times when it comes to manufacturing chips and your partners, right?
We ship a number of devices, that's true. So I think we know what we're doing.
Can you speak to who's manufacturing this for you?
It's a TSMC 6 nanometer process.
Okay, that's what I figured. With 6 nanometers, it's
same process as the 1100, 1200.
Fantastic. Well, there you go. You guys have a really good partnership there
for many years.
I know, and everybody's kind of really having a hard time with chips right now. So the fact that kudos to MediaTek for being able to launch this product, really launch it. You know what I'm saying? It's like one thing when you announce, it's another thing when
just ship volume.
There's this quarter delay between getting the devices out there, right?
Exactly.
Cool. Anything else you want to tell us about the Dimensity 900 or the entire Dimensity lineup while I still have you on the show here?
I think we hit most of the key features, I think, and use cases on the Dimensity 900. I think this is just part of our ongoing strategy. We've talked before about, 5G has really been transformative, I think, for the industry, but also for MediaTek in terms of fueling some of our growth in terms of the smartphone market, our revenue growth. But, we're also seeing a big ramp in 5G globally. We expect about over 500 million 5G devices to ship this year. And it's going to continue to accelerate as it sort of penetrates more and more of the different tiers and the different price points, from the high end, with things like the Dimensity 700 fueling the mass market adoption of 5G going forward. So lots of exciting things happening in 5G.
No, it's a good time to be around. I mean, I think that it's starting to gel. I'm really looking forward to India getting 5G finally, because I feel like, it's a little weird that they're selling these 5G phones in that market, which is extremely price critical and feature critical. Like, I think it drives a lot of kind of like the best lower price competition we see in the market, which makes for better phones and better devices at a lower price point. But it's kind of ironic that a lot of them actually can't be used on any 5G network really there. So I think that's something to look forward to, I think. And of course, in the US, 5G is becoming very rapidly a must-have. I keep saying you don't need it, and so I just said a must-have, but I think it's because the way I see it is, if you buy a phone today, like say the Dimensity 900 phone comes out in a month, and you buy this phone, you're going to keep it a couple of years. And by the time, at least within a year, you're going to be able to benefit from 5G, no matter where you are, at least in this market, the US.
Yeah.
So to me, you don't need it. Yeah, sure, you can wait another 2 years and get a 4G device now and move on to 5G in 2 years. You'll be okay. But why not, at the prices we're looking at with these devices, why not just get yourself a 5G phone and benefit from some of that 5G performance, especially in terms of with sub-6, and especially in terms of like reach, coverage. I think it's not just about performance in terms of speed. It's about, getting a better signal in many more places, right?
Yeah, and I think, what's clearly happened with the kind of volume that's out there in the industry now is, as above certain price tiers, 5G just becomes kind of by default, right? And we've also seen that all of the 5G chipsets are taking advantage of advanced process technology like 7 nanometer, 6 nanometer, etc. Whereas like 4G devices are probably in slightly older technologies. So that allows for a whole bunch of other features and power benefits beyond just the 5G part, and it sort of just gets bundled together as part of the chipset. So it's not just the 5G, but the experience that comes with it, I think.
Yeah, you make a good point. That's true. I mean, sometimes you don't necessarily need to connect to a 5G network to benefit from a chip that has 5G because of the economies of scale around power management and stuff like that, for sure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, listen, Finbar, we're out of time, but thanks so much for being on the show yet again and, teaching us all the good things that we need to know about MediaTek. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Miriam. Thank you.
And folks, I'm now with Igor Bonifacic of Engadget. Hey, Igor, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you, Miriam?
I'm great. So you heard all this MediaTek stuff on the Dimensity 900. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting chip from MediaTek. As we were talking before the show, this is like, for them, it's an important step, right? Like,
yeah,
it's a compelling chip from the standpoint of this is something that we imagine will be competitive with Qualcomm's 700 series chips, right? And
for sure,
I made a point before the show that is like Qualcomm's, I think, now bread and butter, right? The 800 series gets all the attention, but last year it was really the 700 series chips that powered some of the most interesting and best bang for buck phones in the market, right? Like I'm thinking of the Pixel 5 and so on, right?
Yep, 100%. I called it the unsung hero,
right,
of the chip world last year. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the OnePlus Nord, another Snapdragon 700 series phone, and I think MediaTek it's kind of consistently not been necessarily under the radar, but it just hasn't had really, because of how carrier relationships work and, as you mentioned, bias from North American carriers towards Qualcomm and that kind of CDMA legacy.
Yep.
It hasn't really had a chance to break in. And hopefully this is a sign of things to come.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to be talking about MediaTek in the context of the Realme 8 5G in a few minutes. But I wanted to start talking with you about some of the news of this week that are kind of new phones. The ASUS Zenfone 8 series came out this week, and that's kind of an interesting phone. Have you checked out Richard Lai's article?
I mean, how could I not, right? He's one of my colleagues.
I know. How could you not?
Yeah, it's an interesting phone, and I think the question I have is, and for you specifically is, I mean, are we, as much as we love to kind of celebrate these phones that are compact and have headphone jacks, I feel like the market has moved on, right? Unfortunately so, right? And
yeah, to some extent, for sure.
And there's just really no place for these phones anymore, which is a shame, right? Because I miss the days of like kind of the droids, the original droids, right? Where Android was so creative, right? Like the milestone, what we called the milestone in Canada, was just like such a wild and wacky phone. And markets will do this. They will kind of centralize around the kind of quote unquote best, right? Or what consumers want. And there's just not a lot of creativity, and it's nice for all of its seeming flaws with the new ASUS. It is something a bit different, at least.
Yeah, the way I feel about it is I'm kind of a mixed bag in a way. Like I feel, I think there's the narrative that says that there's no innovation in smartphones and variety is flawed. In my opinion, there is a lot of variety and innovation. It is true that our use of phones have radically changed since the milestone, aka Droid. In the sense that we do a lot more work on our phones than we used to. Yeah. And real estate has become a thing. And for better or for worse, I do feel that our phones are often too big in the absolute. Like it's hard to reach the top, whatever, you have to use them two-handed. But the reality is, once I go back to a smaller phone, like for me last year, that was the Pixel 4a and the Pixel 5 mostly, I feel it's not what I need. I feel like something is missing. And so I'm not saying that folks shouldn't have the option. I think they should, but I can understand why the manufacturers are not providing that option. Right. Big phones are particularly popular in Asia, and most of the phone manufacturers are based in Asia. So, that's another thing. But look, we're seeing quite a bit of variety. In this case here, you have the flip camera that's still there on the flip model. We're seeing folding phones. I've got a Vivo X60 Pro Plus here in my pocket with a crazy gimbal camera on it. And, they're still mostly the same, slabs of glass and plastic and metal that mostly do the same thing. But I still think there's enough going on to keep things going. And to me, ASUS, I think, is in a good position to make this Zenfone 8, the small phone, because they're a niche player. Like they subsidize essentially their mobile division through their laptops and other products in the same way as Sony did with the Xperia Minis back in the day, in the same way as to some extent Apple is doing with the iPhone 12 mini, subsidizing it with the 12 and 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max, right? Now, is that worth them doing long term? I don't have the answer for that. Clearly for Sony, it wasn't the case, but you could argue that the Xperia 5 series is the new Mini because it is significantly smaller than the bigger one. And, Google clearly is still playing in the kind of small phone realm. In my opinion, for me, as I've said on the show multiple times in the last 6-7 months since the Pixel 5, since I reviewed it for Hot Hardware, I didn't switch over to that phone being traditionally a Pixel and Nexus user because it's too small for me. Like I would much rather have a Pixel 4a 5G in terms of real estate. However, I'm missing wireless charging on that phone, which is for me a deal breaker. The headphone jack is nice. I can live without it. The water resistance is nice. I can live without it. The high refresh rate is really nice. I really like it, but I can again live without it if I have to. But when I look at this Zenfone 8 and Zenfone 8 Flip, for me, what stands out is kudos to ASUS for trying something in the small phone space, but not making too many compromises. The only one that stands out for me really is no wireless charging. And I've actually asked ASUS about this, and they responded that they'd rather have a larger battery capacity than give up that thickness for wireless charging. And I can see where they're coming from, but I think they're flawed in their reasoning here because it's only a 4,000 milliamp hour battery. Right. And today that's barely acceptable for a flagship. So you could argue now that, they needed all the space they could get for that 4,000 milliamp hour battery. But I would argue that they should have made the phone slightly thicker and stuck wireless charging in there too. Apple has wireless charging on the 12 mini and Google has wireless charging on the Pixel 5. So that I think would have been, as a niche product a much more compelling package, since it is essentially a flagship in smaller form factor, to be able to say we have everything, including the headphone jack. That then you'd have been able to say, oh my God, look at this. This is like the perfect niche phone. But here you kind of have to hold back. And, I kind of a bit bummed by the lack of telephoto, right? Like, I mean, again, if Sony can put a telephoto in the Xperia 5 Mark II and Mark III, apparently, we haven't seen those phones yet, but, why can't ASUS? And then conversely, on the 8 Flip, it feels a little cheap to me, maybe, to take the 7 Pro from last year or the 7 or whatever it was and just change, the SoC from an 865 to an 888 and then go from a side mount fingerprint sensor to a in-display. That's really the only difference. They still don't have OIS on the main sensor on that phone, yet they have OIS on the small phone. Like, it's just so weird to me. Like, how do they make these decisions? I guess the tooling for manufacturing the Flip Pod is probably very expensive to modify, to put a new module with OIS in there. I get that, but it feels half-assed to me, It's like you knew from the reviews last year that we complain of the lack of OIS, yet you decided to continue with that.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine maybe partly this has to do with product development cycles, right? And it's like, how far out are these changes planned, right? And it might be something they have planned for next year, and they're retooling the factories, as you said, to accommodate those changes, but it's just not one of those kind of TikTok or one of those enhancements that they can implement within the kind of talk cycle of the product lifespan.
No, I get that. I'm just demanding. It's my job as a journalist.
Of course. Yeah.
I just, honestly, this is the thing I have a hard time with ASUS. Regardless of the size and what's missing, there's a few things missing, like wireless charging and the OIS on the bigger phone, the one with the Flip. Those in themselves are not big deals. I cannot place where they're going marketing-wise with this because they are affordably priced flagships, relatively speaking. The pricing is right, but then it's kind of like the OnePlus 9 series, right? Especially the 9, the base 9, where they didn't put OIS. Like, you don't do that when your Nord that costs half the price or 2/3 the price has OIS, or last year's equivalent, the AT had OIS. Like, there are some things you just don't remove like that. Not when you have an 888 on board. Like, if you have a 765 on board, I'd be like, okay, I don't like it, but I'll see where you're going here. You're kind of trying to be premium mid-range. I get it. But as soon as you put an 8 series chip, you're telling the world we're not messing about. So stop messing about. Like, where's the stuff we need? Where's the wireless charging? Where's the OIS? Where's the headphone jack is no longer a flagship stake. Even though I want one, I can live without it. It's no longer accepted as a flagship stake. But these other things, to me, should be there.
And to add to that, also there is something to be said about so much of a phone, your experience of a phone in 2021 is the camera, right? And if there is a place that you should not cut cost on, it's the camera, right? And
100%.
To take OIS, which I think in the context of a smartphone is like such a critical component to the quality of the camera, right? I think Google has consistently proven that as great as you can develop software to assist the camera, it only goes so far, right? Like, there's just these physics involved with taking photos that you can't get around, right? Like, no matter what kind of witchcraft you employ, right? And I think we've seen that really consistently as I said, in Google's phones, where they've been using the same 12 megapixel sensor on literally every phone since the Pixel 3 or perhaps even the Pixel 2. And you're seeing the limits of that. And in much the same way, you're seeing those same limits when a manufacturer, like you said, decides not to include OIS.
I mean, it's not a huge deal, right? But I feel like you see how much softer the pictures are in low light immediately on the OnePlus 9 versus, the 8 Pro last year, which had the same sensor with OIS. You see the softness, and I bet you it's the same thing here. And I feel that you're right. Like, I feel like pixel size, fast lenses, optical stabilization. There are some things you do not want to mess with, right? And you want to thrive to have the best performance on these things, because even though you can throw a lot of computational photography at it, you still need to start with a solid base, right?
Right.
And what we're seeing a lot right now is either almost too much computational prowess but not enough hardware, like the Pixels, or we're seeing the reverse. We're seeing like crazy large sensors like the GN2 on the Mi 11 Ultra, or the crazy 108 megapixel sensors of the Galaxy S21 Ultra. And those are great, but the computational know-how there is not quite there. It's lagging compared to. So what I want to see is either Google with the Pixel 5a and 6 upcoming improve the hardware that they use as a base, or I want to see, what we saw with Huawei and the P40 Pro Plus, where strangely the telephoto, the 10X and the 3X as well, have a 8 megapixel sensor that seems pretty vanilla, yet it outputs 12 megapixel photos that are superb in low light, way better in low light than what you'd expect given the specs. And the reason that is happening is because they're using their main sensor to computationally augment what that tiny little 8 megapixel sensor is doing in zooming in low light. And it's kind of crazy that they're blending basically multiple inputs from sensors. Like we keep hearing about Qualcomm and the 888 having 3 ISPs, that's the kind of blending we need to see. Samsung is not blending on the S21 Ultra as far as I know. It's like crazy to me that with all their know-how, with this phenomenal 108 megapixel sensor in terms of hardware, they're not doing that to augment the telephoto.
Yeah, and I also think part of the problem is, phone manufacturers are not in many cases camera manufacturers, right? With the exception of Sony, right? And then even Sony, I somewhat hesitate to call it a camera manufacturer, right? Because it's more of a technology company than anything, an electronics manufacturer, right? But all of that to say is, I almost never, unless it's to kind of share a snap, I almost never use the camera on my phone. I much prefer taking pictures with my Fujifilm, and I hate to be one of those guys, but because I feel like cameras or smartphone cameras still really don't nail so many of the basics, the color science, right? The metering, and these things, I think really separate some of the best cameras from some of the worst cameras. And to my mind, there's really only like Google and Apple kind of nail those basics consistently. And everyone else is kind of like, the colors either don't really look, they're like oversaturated or over sharpened,
for sure.
And I really want to see from these smartphone makers a kind of return to basics, right? Before piling on it superimposes AI image of the moon to make it look brighter or stuff like that.
Yeah, right. There's that story.
Right? So there are those.
No, 100%. I feel, though, that they're aware of it. Like the fact that OnePlus partnered with Hasselblad is an example. I think their intent is to get better color science. It hasn't quite gotten there yet, but it will eventually. I'm confident it will. Same with Huawei and the like. I think the Huawei-Leica partnership has paid off already in terms of color science. And Oppo as well. I don't know if you get these phones in your hands, but the Oppo Find X3 Pro this year is a masterpiece of a phone. Like every time I go back to using it, I'm like, this is really the phone I should be rocking as my main phone to replace my OnePlus 8 Pro. But I can't because it barely does 4G in the US. Like it does, sometimes gives me LTE on T-Mobile, but most of the time I'm stuck in HSPA Plus, which is bad. And this is a 5G phone, never mind 5G. I don't even see that. So that's the challenge, right? It's like, to me, I've talked about this on the show extensively. It's a disappointment somewhat in sense that the Find X2 Pro the previous year had a 5X periscope telephoto that was really, really good. And this one only has a 2X telephoto. But I feel that what they have on the phone now, on the Find X3 Pro, is really solid in terms of imaging, like across the board. Like the ultra wide and the main camera use the same sensor, which means that the color science is perfectly matched.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not this oversaturated, over sharpened color science. It's like they don't have a partnership with anybody specific, but I can tell that they've been really working. Like you just get the kind of shots out of it that you get out of a nice point and shoot from like Fuji or, you know, like from Panasonic or something. And it's just delightful. And that's the thing. I think it's changing. I think people are getting there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, you know, I think we're also, you know, seeing them just kind of deliver more sensible camera packages, right? Like where it's like,
yes,
it's the choice of lenses is sensible, right? The choice of sensors is also sensible. And I think for a long time, there was just a lot of, just like they were doing really weird things. So many manufacturers, right?
Oh my God, yeah. I think you go through that phase, then you kind of stabilize at a place. And that's kind of why I get a little butthurt when I see the lack of OIS. I'm like, you've already learned this lesson.
Right.
Like, we've already gone over this a few years ago. Do you really need to revisit this just to cut like $1 or $2 on your BOM? Like, get the F out of here. Like, not acceptable, okay? Not when you make a flagship. Acceptable when you make a mid-range phone, but not at flagship level.
I mean, this reminds me, sorry for the history trip, but this reminds me of the Nexus 6P when Google made such a big deal of like, we don't need OIS. Anyway.
Yeah. They did that with the original Pixel as well. And I'm just like, I remember tweeting at Google a photo I took on an airplane. You know, I was in business class on one of the Asian airlines, and they have a starry sky on the ceiling. It's fiber optic. So it's really cool at night. You know, they go through that phase of like daytime, and then they dim the lights into a sunrise with the LEDs, and then the sky lights up, and it's all basically like stars, but it's all done through fiber optic. And there was a bit of turbulence at the time, and I tried to capture the stars with my Pixel, and it was when the Pixel just came out. I was flying back from Hong Kong, and I couldn't get a clear shot because there was not too much motion from the turbulence, but just enough that, you know, it opened the shutter so long that I'd get a blur.
Right.
And then I pulled out something like a Galaxy or something or an iPhone that had OIS, and I nailed the shot. Right. And I put it side by side on a tweet. I'm like, this is why you put OIS on your phones, Google. Like, look at how much brighter overall the picture is with your computational awesomeness. Yet I can't get a clear shot simply because I can't open the shutter short enough to get a clear shot because you decide to save $3 on removing OIS from that sensor that you had prior. You know?
Yeah.
It's like, what the F? So this is going to be an ongoing thing for me, my raves and rants about cameras, and especially around the lack of OIS. But this is what I was like, I was really hoping the 8 Flip this year, the Zenfone, would have like just remedied that one thing. Like, I didn't really care. They could have kept the side-mounted fingerprint sensor. I don't need the in-display. Now, I understand that they had to go to an 888 because that's, you know, 10 stakes at this point, right? But then the Zenfone 8, they have OIS, and so good for them. But then they don't have wireless charging. And I live in a world where I do wireless charging all the time. And I can't wean myself off of it anymore. So I just, again, find it weird that wireless charging is still considered like this optional thing. I mean, I want to see it on $200 phones, never mind flagships, where it's sometimes still missing. Like, to me, it should be par for the course like it is for Apple and Samsung. I mean, almost every Samsung and Apple phone that's 500 and more has it. I don't know if all the Galaxy A series do, but I bet you some of them do. And the S series, all of them do, even the Fan Edition. So, I mean, how hard could it be? Like, you know, and OnePlus learned that lesson. They finally put one wireless charging on the 9. The 9 Pro obviously has it because the 8 Pro had it, but it's nice to see. Switching gears, I want to talk a little bit about the Realme 8 5G. I just got it yesterday. The embargo lifted. Like, I basically got it right after the embargo lifted.
Jerks.
So I just made a quick unboxing video, and I'll put it in the show notes. And it's really puzzling to me, this phone. Like, I don't know if you've been following the Realme saga, but they have become OnePlus, essentially. Like, they're a BBK group company. And
it all comes back to BBK.
yeah, it always does. I mean, Oppo and Vivo, we've talked about a few of their phones already. But it's interesting to me that when I reviewed the Realme 7 5G last year in December, or November, December, I also had around the same time the OnePlus Nord N10 5G to review. And what was stunning to me was how much OnePlus had strayed from their formula and messed up the N10 5G, and how much the Realme 7 5G was the phone we wanted the Nord N10 5G to be from the same company, the BBK group. So at the time, I said, of course, you can buy this phone here, but you won't get 5G. So, obviously you want to get the OnePlus if 5G matters to you. But in every way, the Realme 7 5G was more affordable and a better phone all around. Yes. In every way. And so I was like, this is basically what, in my opinion, that's when the tipping point happened, where I felt like OnePlus is kind of maybe going down market, but they're just kind of, it's branding at this point more than anything. Whereas Realme is really trying, because they're very active in India, to deliver the best bang for the buck in terms of specs still, right? And so the 7 5G, the reason I'm bringing it up in the context of the 8 5G is that, 7 5G comes out and it's a great phone, Dimensity 800 from MediaTek, 5G phone. 48 megapixel main camera that didn't suck, 8 megapixel ultra wide, 30 watt fast charging, 120 hertz, 1080p IPS panel for about 220 or so pounds/euros. Okay. Pretty amazing for the spec sheet, right?
Real money as opposed to Canadian money. Yes.
So you're thinking the Realme 8 5G is coming along. It's going to take this and crank it up another notch, right? Nope. Nope, completely no. Same price-ish. For the same RAM configuration, 6 gig, 128, it's about the same price as you can now buy the Realme 7 5G for. And you lose the 120 hertz, you go down to 90. You lose the Dimensity 800, you go down to the 700. You lose the 30 watt charging, you go down to 18 watt charging, and you completely lose the 8 megapixel ultra wide. It's gone. So you don't have an ultra wide anymore. I don't understand the strategy here. The number is higher in the series, right? And progress should be happening. The price is roughly the same. And I think part of it is because the 7 5G is now a few months old, so it's cheaper, right? But nonetheless, why would you buy the 8 5G when you can just get everything slightly better for the same price from the same company from a few months ago? Like, I don't get this phone at all. Like, I do not understand it. The only thing that makes sense to me is that there is a 4 gigabyte, 64 gigabyte version that sells for a measly 179 pounds or euros, which at that point is essentially the cheapest 5G phone on the market. And so as such, good for them, but why didn't they call it something else, like the Realme 8 5G Lite or something? Because this is lacking so many of the features that made the previous series so compelling that I felt like Realme was headed into replacing OnePlus, but in the kind of affordable market, and just along the way just completely shot their foot off, like boom.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, I think, sometimes we have to remember that these phones aren't necessarily made for the end consumer, right? They're made to sell, for carriers and stuff. And I hate to, kind of, especially when it comes to 5G. Now, the review you sent me, which was really great, I was on Andrew Police, they were talking about how, 5G is not even a thing in India, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're selling these 5G phones there.
Right. Yeah. And, it got me thinking about, and sorry, again, listeners, to bring it back to the Pixel family, but, the crazy thing to me is when the Pixel 5 and 4a 5G came out, what was a pleasant surprise in Canada was that it was the kind of exchange rate, it was more favorable, or if you just looked at the price of the phone based on the exchange rate, Google was selling it at a very favorable rate. But what it came down to was that the Canadian model didn't have millimeter wave, right? And in the US, Google had to include millimeter wave for Verizon, right? And that
well, they chose to because they also have a millimeter wave version of the 485G, and that's a separate SKU that is $100 more. So they could have actually made a 5 that was millimeter wave less and sold it for $100 less. And in my review, I said that's what's wrong with it. The price is wrong. It's a great phone. It's too small for me, but the price is wrong.
Right. But all of that to say, so much of these decisions when it comes to particularly 5G, because it is a networking standard and so many of these carriers are trying to build out these networks and trying to sell consumers on 5G, whether the benefits of it are real or not, right, come down to carriers, right? And ultimately for companies, maybe less so with Realme, but more so, with North American manufacturers, their client is not you, the consumer, it is carrier.
Yeah, of course.
Right? So I think that's something you just have to keep in mind with this phone in particular. It's about, moving people, but I will say the weird thing about this phone especially, and is like, 5G, in buying a phone with 5G, you're quote unquote future-proofing your phone, right? Or you're future-proofing your purchase, excuse me. And yet this phone is probably only going to get one major version of Android.
Yeah, like a lot of the Chinese phones. Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, right? Yeah. I don't even bring it up anymore because it's like a given. Like I now write about the fact that if it's going to get more than 1 or 2 updates, then I actually mention it because that's, I agree that it should be the default, but it's not the reality we live in. And for this price, at this price point, £179 for 4 gig, 64 gigabyte, version, it's almost disposable, at least to us here in North America. Now, I know this is primarily sold to India, where the customer is really the end user, not so much the carrier, since they don't have 5G. That's why I'm a little puzzled by the cutting of features on a newer model of the same phone. And I'm also a bit puzzled by we're selling it super cheap, but we're not going to get updates because in that market, it's price sensitive. People want to keep their phones for a while because they can't afford a flagship necessarily. So it's a little weird to me what Realme's doing here. I'm not saying it's a bad phone in the absolute. It's an okay phone. It feels really nice. It does what it says on the box. I just feel like it's just such a weird positioning. And I've actually reached out to Realme, as I mentioned in my unboxing video, and said, hey, can you explain the marketing here? Can you explain the position of this phone when you consider that the previous model is now attainable for roughly the same price and has more features? Like, why should I buy the new one?
Did they answer?
No, not yet.
I mean,
they said they would get back to me, though. I think, the PR people have to ask the headquarters in China.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is also something to be said about like BBK where it is right now. And I think it is, there's just like in that company, it feels like there's no really space for kind of that like OnePlus type company that is actually doing, like, ultimately it comes down to like pushing volume, right, with that company, right? Because I think most people don't know that like BBK is bigger in terms of like smartphone sales, is way bigger than Huawei, right? Like,
for sure. Yeah.
And in a good year, it's probably as good or better than Samsung, right? Like, when you put together all of its subsidiaries, right? And it's interesting that kind of like, the like IDC and they never put these companies together and they just kind of treat them as separate entities.
Oh, it's just weird.
Right? And I think it paints the wrong picture. But ultimately, I mean, again, as I'm making this point, it occurs to me like, how does within that context of pushing as much volume as possible, why would you release a phone like this that is less compelling than its previous,
and that's why I asked them. I'm like, if you had named this differently as an entry level 5G, this is the most affordable 5G phone we're making it, I would have said, okay, great.
Yeah.
But then it's just puzzling. Speaking of other MediaTek phones that came out this week, Infinix has launched the Note 10 Pro, which is a 4G phone with a Helio G95. So it's got a bit of a gaming slant to it, primarily because of that Helio G95, but also 90 hertz, 1080p panel. It's 6.95 inches.
Insanity.
It's massive.
Yeah.
It's huge. 180 hertz refresh on the touch. So obviously for gamers, this is like it's $259. So I think this is a pretty good setup, like for if you want to play games and get, kind of like a gaming optimized chipset that's 4G. And it's got a 64 megapixel main camera that's not great, but not horrible, perfectly usable. The low light is pretty decent on it because there's a dedicated low light augmentation sensor, like one of those 2 megapixel sticker cams, like I call them. But this one actually does something useful. There's a macro as well. The macro is actually the ultra wide. The ultra wide has autofocus on this 259 phone.
That's wild.
That doubles as a macro. Like when I started using it, I thought like there's 4 cameras in the back. So I thought there's a main and an ultra wide. And then I thought, well, one of them is going to be a macro and the other one's got to be a depth, right? Logically, no, that's not what it is at all. There's a 64 megapixel main and 8 megapixel ultra wide that doubles as a macro because there's autofocus. And then there's 2 megapixel sensors. One is for depth and one is for this black and white augmentation. For basically, it's just a black and white sensor that captures low light to augment the computational oomph of the main sensor, and it pays off. So I'm actually pretty surprised. It's not gonna, win any awards, but it, for the money, is decent. Big battery. It doesn't have NFC. There's a version with NFC, but the one they sent me did not have NFC. No wireless charging, but 30 watt.
Sorry.
I don't expect wireless charging there. That's why you're laughing. I know. Yeah. But 30 watt wired. Look, I mean, for $259 is good. The problem is these phones are primarily sold in Africa and South America.
Right.
And we're probably not going to see this phone in the US. But check out my unboxing video. I'll put it in the show notes. I just am excited to see that a lot of the stuff that we were expecting to pay like $300+ for just even 6 months ago is now down to like $250. It's crazy. I mean, you saw the video. It's not a bad package. It's big.
I mean, I think the thing I was the things that threw me about that phone was one, the sticker that you had to peel off. I loved how in the box, you had the specs on the box, you open the box, and then there's a sticker with the specs yet again on the phone. But beyond that, I was like shocked how good that phone looks, right? Like,
it looks great, right? Even though it's all plastic, it actually feels great too, which is pretty amazing.
I mean, and granted, I'm kind of experiencing it through your video. And so I don't, it is very much a transformational experience to hold the phone, right? Like until you have it in your hands, you can't really it's one thing to say it's like 6.9 inches, this display. And
it's really big.
And another thing to hold it in your hands and being like, what were they thinking, right?
Well, I think they were thinking gaming phone, essentially, on a budget,
I mean, I will say, granted, this is a phone that is, as you said, for the African market and stuff, but I'm not really sold on this concept of Android gaming phones, because I think ultimately the best gaming phone is an iPhone, if only because of the kind of games that come to the iPhone first, or just don't come to Android at all, right? And
then you put a controller, one of those like the Razer one or whatever that has, that gives you all the controls and holds your phone snugly in the middle.
Yes.
And
perfection.
I don't even think you need shoulder buttons at that point. You're done, right? I'm very much like you, but I do have to say that the amount of interest I'm seeing, especially writing for Hot Hardware part of my time, where they're focused on a lot of gaming stuff. The interest I'm seeing from hardcore gamers around specific gaming phones like the ROG Phone 5 and even like the Red Magic 6. I just got a review in it. I don't have enough time under my belt to really talk much about it. But it's interesting to me that I thought this was going to be a fad, but it's sticking around.
Right. And I think, but I think where the ROG Phone and the Redmi have an advantage is the ROG Phone is kind of a known quantity, and there are actually developers who are going to optimize their games for these devices, right? And where some of these, it's one thing to have a 90 hertz display, but it's no good to you unless, they plug in the code to take advantage of that, right? And that's where...
Speaking of, by the way,
yes,
the Red Magic 6 has a 165 hertz display. So get out of here, okay?
Yeah. That is
crazy. I don't even know why they're bothering. Who supports it?
Yeah, right. And and I think that's kind of unfortunately still the state we are in the Android market, which is it's a lot of this like, can we fill out this spec sheet to make it look good? And not thinking ahead to the kind of holistic experience of like, yeah, sure, we can put in a 165 hertz display, but if we can't convince Epic to optimize Fortnite for this, what's the point? Right? You know?
Yeah, but you see, I think the counterpoint to what you were saying around the iPhone being the best gaming phone is that it doesn't have a more than 60 hertz refresh, and that actually makes a difference for gamer. Gamers tell me all the time the touch sample rate and the display refresh rate are really critical to them. So this will be addressed with the iPhone 13. Will we get 120 hertz? I'm pretty confident we will. And then I think your point will be made. But I think until then, I mean, there is an opportunity for Android gaming phones to be a thing, especially the ones like the Lenovo Legion that have the actual shoulder buttons are physical. They're not capacitive like on the Red Magic or the ASUS ROG. You know, to me, like if you're going to put shoulder buttons, like, come on, give me clicky, give me like even analog progressive shoulder buttons. Otherwise, I might as well just use one of those, as you said, like the Razer or whatever, that accessory that clamps my phone and gives me actual controls because, you know, it's a little bulky, but I'd carry that around if I was a hardcore gamer for sure.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears because I don't want to run out of time, but I want to talk about Moto. You wrote an article for Engadget about this. You know, we've heard about this remote wireless charging where instead of being on a pad or like sitting on a surface, you actually can be a few feet away from the wireless charger and magically your phone charges. You know, Xiaomi did a demo recently. Moto did a demo a while back. But like, what do you make of this announcement? This is a little puzzling to me.
So can I just say, when you first sent me the show notes, I was thinking, why would Miriam want to talk of all the things I wrote this week, of all the beautiful articles I wrote? Why did they want to talk about this, right? And now it all makes sense. Wireless, this is the evolution of wireless charging you've been waiting for, right?
Yeah.
But to answer your question, it is an especially strange announcement coming from Moto, which, you know, yes, it has the Razer, yes, it has the Edge Plus, but really it's, you know, like wheelhouse.
The Edge Plus is the only phone I think they make that has wireless charging right now, actually.
Yeah, but you know, like its wheelhouse is like the Moto 1s and Moto Gs and Moto Es of the world,
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
like, none of these phones.
Mid-range.
Yeah, like these are phones where it's like, yeah, like Moto, get on it and try to put wireless charging into these phones. And you're like, no, we're going to the next step, remote wireless charging, right? This, you know, so I think of any company that has really talked about this, Xiaomi has kind of put the best foot forward and it's actually shown off a demo and is like, we have these patents and we, you know, this is the work we've done. But I still don't I really don't get the appeal of this, right? Like charging your phone remotely at 5 watts sounds like, okay.
No, I'm much more on board with, you know, what we're seeing, the trend we're seeing with Chinese manufacturers at the flagship level, like 60 watt wireless, 50 watt wireless.
Right.
Like to me, fast charging has changed the way I use my phones. I no longer charge overnight.
Yes.
I charge on demand. But because I do have a lot of wireless chargers around and my car has one as well, that's primarily the reason I like wireless charging, honestly, is I hop in my Tesla, I put it down, and it charges, and I don't have to worry about it. Is it slow? It's 10 watt or whatever. It's fine though, because it gives me on a road trip, gives me just that trickle charge I need to keep the phone up and running and happy, you know.
Yeah.
But then I don't have to fiddle with cables, you know. It's just nice. I have also a charging stand, a Pixel charging stand on my desk, and actually I've replaced it with the OnePlus one since I have a OnePlus 8 Pro now. But for the longest time I had the Pixel stand here on my desk, and it's just nice to just plop it down. But honestly, it's the fast thing that's really making it work for me. The 30 watt wireless on my older OnePlus 8 Pro, the 50 watt on the OnePlus 9 Pro, the 30 watt on the Oppo Find X3 Pro. That works for me. But like a few feet away, like what you're talking about, it's like, why? Especially at 5 watt, as you said, like 5 watt, seriously.
And also, I will say, you know, I think there's a very important point, which is, you know, you say you charge your phones now on demand as opposed to overnight. And I think that is like the secret to having a phone that lasts you for a while, right? And not having to replace that battery, because the worst thing can do for your phone is just idle it at 100%, as you're prone to do when you leave it to charge overnight, right? So I mean, there's so many unanswered questions with this technology, right? Like it's one thing to talk about it in kind of theory, but completely another, like we haven't seen any of the kind of like practical application of how it would work. And that for me is just like, what is the user experience of this? Like, will it just like top up your phone and keep it topped up? I'd have to kind of see it in practice. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so weird for it to be a Moto thing here in this case. Like, it's just so like off script for them.
Right.
I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. I'm on board. I mean, they do have a lot of expertise with wireless. This is Moto. They, are one of the innovators in the space in general. They worked very closely with Qualcomm and Verizon on 5G back in the day. So, I believe that if anybody has the chops, they do, but it just doesn't fit in their image and their marketing very well, right?
And let it be said that like Weird Moto is the best Moto, right?
Always. I mean, Weird, any phone company, in my opinion, is the best phone company.
Right.
Because it might be a little off in left field, but it just brings goodness to things. I want to wrap things up with the MacBook Air rumors. You and I are both Mac users, at least partially. And I, bought an M1 Air not very long ago, like back in November when it was announced. And let's just cut to the chase. There are rumors of a new MacBook Air coming at some point that has the industrial design and aesthetic of the new iMac 24, meaning white is grayish. It's gray, technically grayish bezels, pastel colors, and potentially a grayish matching, whitish matching keyboard. And some people are freaking out and are horrified right now. Personally, I like what I saw on the 24-inch iMac for its intended audience. It makes sense to me. And it's a nod to the, colorful iMacs of days past, and I get it. And, again, it's like Apple being weird, good stuff. But I'm on board with this Air. Like, how do you feel?
So conflicted, right? One, I love the design, and I really do want, a return to kind of the fun Apple of like the Steve Jobs era. But conversely, I also want like a return of the practical Apple of the Steve Jobs era, right? And, one of the things, there's a lot of things about the iMac that kind of, this new iMac that just really like kind of, I'm like, you guys were so close and yet so far, right? And it's like the port situation, right? Like, why do you need to upgrade to the more expensive SKU to get USB-A, right? And it's like,
or to get the Ethernet on the power brick, or to get the Touch ID on the keyboard,
right? Like these are all like, a computer, more so than your smartphone, is like a very practical thing, right? And it should be kind of designed in a way to make it as practical as possible. And I think why so many people still so fondly remember, the 2015 MacBook Air is it was kind of the perfect computer in many ways, right? Yes, it was like, the display was just good enough. Like it had a good mix of ports. It had a good mix of power. And then kind of Apple lost its way with the 2018 MacBook Air, right? It was like really underpowered, right?
Yeah.
That like those Intel chips just weren't doing any favors for that computer, right? And they, the keyboard, obviously, we're not, if we get into the butterfly keyboard, this will be another podcast.
I think the audience is well aware. We've talked about it before.
Right. So anyway, all of that to say, like, we haven't seen, I think, the most important parts of this computer in this Prozer leak, right? Like the ports, right? And how whatever this MagSafe situation will work, how will it work, right? Yeah. Like I have so many questions about that because I think, I know people are nostalgic for MagSafe, but in a lot of ways, USB-C is a much better solution because it is a standardized solution, right? It's like,
exactly,
it is, you only need one.
I'm okay with a proprietary MagSafe of any kind as long as there's also the ability to charge over USB-C, which I think they will do. I think they're going to do it. It's do dual mode.
Yeah.
A lot of laptops are like that right now. So
yeah. So I think, as long as they do that, and I know hoping for an SD card reader is like crazy talk.
I think on an Air,
Yeah.
it's unlikely.
Yeah.
I think the next gen Pros, I think the 16-inch MacBook Pros, there's very strong rumors we're going to see SD back, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case.
Right.
Because they've listened. If we've learned anything from Apple in the last couple of years, they're actually listening to their customers.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and one of the most distinct memories I have of one of our interactions is when we were in Hawaii for a previous Snapdragon Summit, and we talked about our love for Macs, right? And how hard it was to see, like, just like, in some sense, for some of us, like the Mac is a more important product in Apple's lineage than the iPhone, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And to see the company kind of just like lose sight of what made the Mac so great for so long was really hard to see, right? And so I'm tentatively hopeful that the company kind of gets back to making both really like stylish and practical computers, because computers are great, right? Like they let you do so much, and they should be a reflection of that.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I have good feelings about this. I think that we have to remember that the MacBook Air is a consumer product, not the product that you and I want.
Sure.
And that as such, the same thing applies to the iMac 24, that I hope the iMac 27 or 30 or whatever resolves that, the port things. And honestly, I don't have a problem if I want to go crazy with the colors on an iMac, a larger iMac or even the MacBook Pro. But I think they do also have to address the existing MacBook design. They got to give us the colors we're used to already, right? Like that's going to need to happen.
Yeah.
But listen, we should wrap it up, Igor. Do you want to tell folks where they can find you on the internet, all the various social media handles and whatever else? Obviously, there's Engadget, but...
Yeah, so if you've not heard of this site, it's engadget.com, and you can find me at Igor Bonifacic, that's Igor, Bonifacic, Twitter.com. And that's, I'm not a prolific tweeter by any means, but sometimes I will have lukewarm takes about certain things.
I like that. Lukewarm takes. Yeah, you folks should definitely read Igor on Engadget. Good stuff. And folks, you know where to find me on the internet. I'm at Tankgirl. That's TNKGRL, both on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want to talk about the podcast, tweet at me and Igor, and we'll answer your questions about this show. If you want to see pretty pictures taken with phones and pretty pictures of phones, go to my Instagram. And there are 2 YouTube channels you should subscribe to that are related to this podcast. YouTube.com/MobileTech which is the main channel, has a lot of unboxing videos, some reviews, some hands-ons, that kind of stuff, but it's mostly specifically focused on mobile devices and mobile tech. And then we have Mobile Tech More, which is youtube.com/MobileTech and that's a new channel that my producer and I are developing. So please subscribe. There's not a lot of content there, but we're going to try to do like things like travel tech, home automation stuff, all the peripheral things, all the weird battery packs and things that I get sent that are kind of fun but different. It's all going to go there. So please subscribe. Help us bring the subscriber count up so that we can get rolling on that. Also, the podcast lives at mobiletechpodcast.com. If you want to subscribe the old way, you can do that. There's an RSS feed there. But we're on all the big platforms, basically. Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify. If you want to subscribe, that's where you should go. And if your app supports rating or reviewing the show, please consider doing that. It helps with discovery, so that's a nice thing. Also, there is a donate button in the show notes. If you can donate some money and help me do this on a weekly basis, it'd be great. It's a PayPal button, and you'll see it's pretty straightforward. And finally, I want to thank our sponsor, MediaTek. MediaTek's Dimensity 5G family powers the highest-end smartphones and brings flagship 5G technology to the mass market so everyone can experience the power of 5G. With MediaTek Dimensity, you can expect incredible. So thanks again to MediaTek for sponsoring this show. And Igor, thanks again for being my guest. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, folks, we'll have Igor on again at some point in the future. And you know there's going to be a show next week. And that show is all going to be about Google I/O. So stay tuned for that. And until then, folks, cheers, everybody.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with Tank Girl, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.